Hello, everybody. This is Melinda Stewart welcoming you to Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, known as TEFCA, our overview webinar today. Our first speaker is Alan Swenson, the Executive Director of Care Quality. Alan, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. Glad to be here with everyone. Didi Davis is here with me as well. I am here as far as in the TEFCA context, the operations and technical lead for the RCE program. Didi is the standards and conformance testing lead for the RCE program. And so we're going to go through a pretty quick and high-level overview of a lot of things going on with TEFCA. Feel free to put your questions in the question window, and we'll see what we can answer as we're going through, or have time for questions at the end. But otherwise, we are going to go pretty quick and pretty high level, and we'll see if there's need for follow-ups and things afterwards. So we'll jump right in here. As was said, TEFCA is the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement. We are going to go through some of the basics of that timeline, go through some of the various framework documents, some of the technical documents, and then educational resources and FAQs that are available on the website, and answer any questions with some of the time we have remaining at the end. So TEFCA, for those who are not familiar with it, or as a reminder, maybe even if you are, TEFCA, again, is the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement. It was established or part of the 21st Century Cures Act back in 2016. And it had a few goals to establish universal governance, policy, and technical floor for nationwide interoperability, to simplify connectivity for organizations to be able to exchange for all of these various purposes that we'll talk about, and to enable individuals to gather their own healthcare information and manage that themselves. The Office of the National Coordinator, at that time at least, names have changed since then. You'll see on the slides we're still working through some of the rebranding that ONC has gone through, but we still refer to them here as ONC. The Office of the National Coordinator was tasked with being in charge of coordinating the work of TEFCA. They contracted with the Sequoia Project as the recognized coordinating entity. And the role of the recognized coordinating entity is really to actually oversee, coordinate with ONC and the federal government on the things, how this is all going to work. But the RCE is the one that ultimately is responsible for designating QHINs. Those are the Qualified Health Information Networks that apply and are designated to be the nodes, and we'll get into that here in a second, for the actual exchange, collaborating with ONC on policy direction and how all of this will expand over time, and then monitoring the network, addressing non-compliance in the network, handling oversight of governance and things throughout this exchange framework. So TEFCA is live today. There are, as you can see on the screen, there are currently 7 designated QHINs. Each of these 7 have gone through the rigorous application and onboarding and testing process and have gotten through to designation. We do have others that are in the pipeline. This is an open application. We did not have any period where application was we were accepting applications and then closed that. Rather, it's just constantly open. New organizations can come forward and get into the process or start the process at any point. So as noted on the screen here, we have 7 designated QHINs. We have 2 candidate QHINs who have gotten through the application process and are in conformance testing right now. That conformance testing is testing all of the technical requirements that a QHIN has to support, and that they've asserted that they do support in their application, but now proving it through actual conformance testing tools. We have one that has recently had its application accepted and is getting ready to move into conformance testing. And then we have, as you can see, a letter of intent is really the starting point. Organizations will reach out, let us know that they intend to apply. We'll have some initial discussions and make sure that that makes sense and how they want to move forward. There are 10 of those that have come forward and then decided that they actually did not want to apply once they had some initial discussions. We have 3 of those that are currently active and certainly could move into applications being submitted. Looking at some of the various components of TEFCA, framework agreements are things like the common agreement. And the terms of participation, we'll talk about those a little bit. Those are the terms that flow down from a QHIN to the organizations within their networks. And these are terms that are set as consistent terms. Everybody has to agree to the same terms. There's no custom versions, no red lines. Every QHIN agrees to the same common agreement, and every participant, sub-participant throughout the framework, regardless of which QHIN they're participating in, agrees to the same terms of participation. And this ensures that there's the ability for trust across the framework, and that every organization doesn't necessarily have to know a whole lot about others who are participating, where they're participating, how they're participating, because everyone has agreed to the same terms. We have standard operating procedures. I will get into a whole bunch of those. There are lots of standard operating procedures, and those detail some of the more specific policies around things that don't need to be called out in the main common agreement or terms of participation contract, but are standard policies and procedures that are required of anyone who is using whatever that SOP is about. So again, we'll get into some of the details of those. Technical requirements, there are a number of technical documents. We'll talk about some of those, QHIN technical framework, the FIRE implementation guide, things like that. The RCE directory is the one actual technical piece that is really maintained by the RCE for use in production QHIN exchange. And that is maintained by QHINs. Again, we'll get into more of the specifics about it, but it's maintained by the QHINs to list all of the information about themselves and their network, their participants and sub-participants, so that everyone can find each other and access information from that directory. It is a FIRE-R4 organization and endpoint directory. So we'll talk more about that. Oversight and compliance and governance kind of go together. Now that we have designated QHINs and exchange happening, there are SOPs around, and then there are governing bodies overseeing what is actually happening within TEFCA. Exchange in TEFCA. So diagram here a little bit. Again, the RCE is the kind of umbrella up at the top there, working closely with ONC. ONC defines the overall policy and the governance requirements. And then the RCE is the one providing oversight and governing directly with the QHINs. The QHINs, again, those qualified health information networks, are the ones that have the contractual agreement with the RCE and have signed that common agreement so that they can all exchange between each other. Each QHIN then connects its participants and sub-participants. And those two terms are really just contractual terms. Any type of organization that participates in TEFCA could be a participant or sub-participant. There's no fundamental difference between the two, but a participant is an organization that contracts directly with a QHIN. A sub-participant is an organization that contracts with a participant or potentially with a sub-participant above it. So you could have multiple sub-participants below each other. So those are really just contract terms. Again, the framework agreements, we have the common agreement, talked about that a little bit, participant, sub-participant terms of participation, talked about those as well. And those all define for a TEFCA connector, which would be any type of system that is participating and connects its customers, and TEFCA connected entities being any of those that organizations that sign a framework agreement. Again, those could be vendors who are providing connectivity to their customers. That could be, individual provider organizations, payers, public health authorities, patient access apps. All sorts of different types of organizations could be signing onto these agreements to do whatever is appropriate for them to do based on the type of organization they are. As an example of kind of what a QHIN structure could look like here, in the example here, we have a QHIN, and it has some directly connected participants on the top line, where there's a standalone provider organization, an HIE. That HIE then has sub-participants, where they've got a consumer-facing app and a public health authority that are both sub-participants to that health information exchange. You've got a health system that is connected there in the middle. They have an EHR, and the provider end users of that health system are not individually signing some agreement. They're not sub-participants. They're just the end users of that participant EHR system. There's pharmacy IT system that has some pharmacies as sub-participants, and a consumer app, which for the consumer app, the individual end user is its essentially just its user. Each individual that participates isn't signing a contractual agreement as a participant or sub-participant themselves. They're just essentially the end users of their chosen consumer app. When we lay out all of the policies and get into some of the technical documents as well, there is kind of a hierarchical flow or structure here. Applicable law first and foremost. Don't do anything that breaks the law. Just by general rule of thumb, follow the law. Within applicable law, we then have the framework agreements, and then we have the QHIN technical framework and other technical documents, along with the SOPs that all build on and expand some of the requirements from those base framework agreements. So standard operating procedures. The SOPs, already talked about this a little bit, but they really get into more of the specific details around some of the governance, privacy, security. There's SOPs about the directory, SOPs about various exchange purposes, implementation SOPs. There are many SOPs, and they are all of the additional policy and procedure that, again, didn't need to be specifically in the contractual common agreement, but are still binding on everyone who participates to the extent that an SOP specifically applies to you. And so each SOP also defines who it is applicable to. For an exchange purpose implementation SOP, for example, it would define requirements for a payer who wants to send requests for healthcare operations. The healthcare operations SOP would be applicable to what that payer needs to do for sending those requests. That SOP would be less applicable to someone who is never sending or sharing information for the purpose of healthcare operations. The exchange purposes SOP is one we'll get into in some more detail here specifically, but it defines all of the various exchange purposes or purposes for which information can be exchanged. The SOPs, as noted on the right here, also give some additional flexibility. There are still some pretty strict change management processes for updating SOPs, but over time, as we need to evolve and expand, we can add additional SOPs. We can modify SOPs without having to modify the base common agreement contractual terms. Looking at timeline here quickly, for those that, again, have been following along, the Common Agreement version 1 was published back in January of 2022. In December of 2023, we published Common Agreement version 1.1. That primarily was some changes that HHS specifically needed and requested be made for some of the governance pieces that were outlined in the Common Agreement. We then, in July 2024, so here just, I guess July was already 2 months ago, or already almost 2 months ago, a month ago, we published Common Agreement version 2, which is now the version that is on the website. Organizations are new applicants would be signing version 2. That is the applicable version moving forward. There is still a bit of a transition timeline moving from 1.1 to version 2. To the extent that you already are a participant or sub-participant participating in TEFCA Exchange, this is hopefully all information that you've discussed with your QHIN. If you're not yet, then some of this may not be actually all that relevant. You may just sign the updated agreement. But we did put in place a timeline for when all of these new documents, terms of participation, Common Agreement version 2, SOPs and things would go into effect, giving QHINs some time to roll out the terms of participation from Common Agreement version 2 to their participants and sub-participants who had already agreed to prior versions of that agreement without having to break connectivity. So there is still a timeline in process here for getting some of those updated terms out to existing participants and sub-participants. So jumping into some of the more substantive stuff here, on the RCE website, you'll see that we have all of the available resources on a resources page, and this is just a screenshot kind of showing how that is structured. But when you go to the resources page, you'll see the core requirements, which include Common Agreement, terms of participation, various technical requirements, and then we have exchange purpose implementation SOPs grouped together. And those are implementation SOPs about specific purposes, reasons for which you are exchanging information. There are privacy and security related SOPs, and then there are governance SOPs. Since we've got all of those broken out, there are a couple of other sections at the bottom with the educational resources that we'll get to later on as well. In July of this year, just last month, we published the QHIN Technical Framework version 2, and we'll talk a bit about that, along with the Facilitated Fire Implementation SOP. We published a number of other SOPs, as you can see here. Just here a couple weeks ago, on August 6th, we published several more SOPs that you can see in the middle, and we'll do a quick run through of many of these SOPs. Very high level and very quick, as you can see on the screen, there's a lot. And then we still have some more that are in the works right now and expected to come here in the fall, which is almost here. So starting with the exchange purposes SOP. The exchange purposes SOP, again, defines the purposes for which information can be exchanged, the codes for how those are exchanged, and the requirements around exchange of information. There are currently, however many are in that table, number of exchange purpose codes that are defined. There are 6 level 1 codes. Those are the primary, quote, authorized exchange purposes. And a number of those have subcodes, which you'll see listed here as level 2. And those are generally like for healthcare operations, for example. Healthcare operations has a top level 1 code, which is essentially healthcare operations as defined in HIPAA. We then have defined specific codes and use cases for when you're doing care coordination or case management, when you're doing HEDIS reporting, when you're doing other quality measure reporting. And those have specific requirements for the use of those codes within the healthcare operations SOP, separate from broad healthcare operations as a huge definition in HIPAA, where you might not, the organization receiving that may not know exactly what's being done. So the level 2 codes provide further specificity on the reason for a request, especially in a case where the level 1 code is a broad definition and could include many things. Public health, for example, is another one that is being used actively today already. Electronic case reporting is a subcode that we have defined within public health, and we do have electronic case reporting happening today in TEFCA for getting that information to public health authorities. The directory service requirements policy is the SOP that defines what organizations, primarily QHINs are the ones that manage everything in the directory, how things are managed in the directory, what goes in the directory, and all of that. So again, the RCE maintains the RCE directory service. That is a FHIR R4 organization and endpoint directory. It's built off US core organization and endpoint profiles, resources that we then add and extend to and build out some custom things as needed specifically for use in TEFCA. But we do manage that FHIR server, and QHINs all have their own individual API keys for accessing and maintaining the directory information about themselves and their customers, and downloading the information about other QHINs and their participant and sub-participant customers. There are requirements in the RCE directory service and also some in the QTF around like the timelines of when QHINs need to publish an update to the directory before that update goes into effect to make sure it has time to propagate throughout the other QHINs and down into their networks. Timelines on how often QHINs have to check the directory to see if there are updates from the other QHINs. So that is required no less often than once per day, no more often than hourly. Most do that as just a standard nightly process. But making sure that everybody then knows about and has all of that information to search for connections across all of the participating QHINs and their networks. This provides all the electronic endpoint information and other details. And we're actually making a number of updates to the directory implementation guide. And the implementation guide, for those that are interested in seeing that is one of the technical documents available on the resources page as well. And so we are in the process of making some updates to that implementation guide, which is a FHIR IG, as you would expect. We are making updates to that based on some of the changes that are now needed from the policy direction of this RCE directory service SOP. Individual access services is one that we just published as an update, fairly substantial in a few areas. If anyone had been looking at previous versions of some of these SOPs, this one looks like it has a whole lot more update than it actually does in some areas, and that's because we restructured it from version 1 to match the structure of how we're putting things in various sections for new SOPs. But this one does define some important things, and this is about an individual getting access to their own clinical information. So IAS is what we refer to as the services that are provided to an individual, those individual access services. And an IAS provider is the organization that provides those services. That could be a QHIN, that could be a participant, that could be a sub-participant, and this could be a standalone patient app. This could be a provider portal where the portal adds in the ability for an individual to actually leverage TEFCA Exchange and go request their own information from other places. But any QHIN participant or sub-participant that is offering these IAS services would be an IAS provider. And this SOP defines what needs to be done with identity proofing for individuals. There is an OpenID Connect token that is used and comes back from the credential service provider who does that IAL2 identity verification and is sent in the actual technical transaction so that the responding system can store that for auditing purposes, can open it up, validate the token, use those demographics for matching purposes if they need to. And all of that is defined within this individual access services implementation SOP. Public health, and I think I saw there were some questions potentially in chat, and I'm trying to see that over on one screen as I'm looking at the other here as I'm talking. But I know public health is one that has been a pretty big focus, and we did just publish an updated version, or publish the final version. I guess we've had some drafts before of the public health implementation SOP. And so this does define codes for electronic case reporting and electronic lab reporting are the two main ones here. It does also have other requirements around when a public health authority is sending requests for information and querying using the public health exchange purpose code. And that could be for any number of purposes that a public health authority needs to request information, including case investigation or other purposes. But we have some specific requirements in the SOP defining how all of these are used. And as I said, the electronic case reporting, we do have a number of organizations and a couple of public health authorities. I think there have been a few more added since then that started using this right on July 1st when this SOP was published. Specifically for electronic case reporting, but there is some amount of public health query happening as well. So definitely excited to see that one continue to expand and more involvement from the public health community. Healthcare operations is another big one. This one was just published here August 6th, here a couple weeks ago. And as I noted before, this one defines codes for some subcategories for care coordination and case management, for quality measure reporting, and for HEDIS reporting. It does then have requirements around some of those codes are only really health plans would be using them. Some of them are healthcare providers could also be using them depending on the purpose, which code and what's appropriate there. Or a delegate, which is a separately defined, there's an SOP about delegation of authority, where an organization could delegate authority to someone else to make requests on their behalf. And so a delegate or a health plan or a provider could have a delegate doing some of these things for them as well. Right now, those subcodes are listed as you should reply. It's not should respond and share information for any of these queries. It is not required. However, beginning 18 months following the initial publication date being August 6th of 2024, those three subcodes, care coordination, case management, quality measure reporting, and HEDIS, all do become required responses. So those who are participating in TEFCA Exchange are going to have those 18 months to get everything ready to begin. If they don't otherwise begin responding because it's optional today and available today, within 18 months, everyone will need to have started sharing for those defined healthcare operations subcodes. We have a QHIN security for the protection of TEFCA information, and this was a recent update that just was published here earlier this month, so an August 6th SOP. This one defines what the Cybersecurity Council in TEFCA does. That is one of the governing bodies in TEFCA. It is made up primarily of the CISOs from each of the QHINs, and then representatives from some participants and sub-participants and others as well. But it defines a lot of the requirements around third-party cybersecurity certification that QHINs need to have, and that is part of the application and onboarding process, is providing verification and proof of having the appropriate cybersecurity certification that meets all of the requirements that we set. There are requirements in there around annual security assessments and audits that need to be done, and when and how that information needs to be shared with the RCE, and there are some requirements as well that flow down to participants and sub-participants to ensure that we have proper auditing and security controls for this access to and exchange of information through TEFCA. And I believe that brings us to the technical documents, and I'm going to hand things over here to Didi, unless Didi, there were any. I see there are a bunch of questions that have come in, and I saw some of them were being answered as we were going. Are there any that we want to quickly answer right now before we jump into technical documents, or just circle back on those at the end?
I think you read my mind. I've been answering the questions that I felt very comfortable answering for folks, so I've been kind of keeping up with those. There are some in here that I think we should answer live. And we will address those somewhat as well in the slides that I'll be covering. So I don't have any that we need to cover other than maybe the very first one in the list. The SOPs and the common agreement do not address responsibilities of participants or QHINs in the event of improper EHI disclosure related to notifications or financial responsibility as a result. Will this be addressed in a future version? I think there's maybe a high level answer we could provide there that might help.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, definitely take a look at the updates to the cybersecurity SOP, the one that I just covered there last. There are requirements around TEFCA security incidents and other types of notifications of any sort of incident or improper access or things like that to information. Now, part of the question was, about like financial impact and things like that. Maybe worth, having a follow-up discussion, and we can chat about some of what you're thinking or specifically concerned about there if there's not something already covered. But part of that cybersecurity SOP is intended to expand over time to build out more of the requirements around different types of events that would be considered a reportable event, and what participants, sub-participants, and QHINs need to do when one of those reportable events happens.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we highlighted that one of the main goals that ONC has, ASTP ONC has for TEFCA is to make sure that trust is always maintained. So that's continuing to evolve as needed over time as well. All right. Well, thanks. Feel free to answer any of the questions in the background, Alan, that you feel comfortable doing so. We will leave time at the end to answer these, hopefully most of them all live. All right, so if we'll go to the next slide, I'm going to be covering more of the technical document components that make up TEFCA. So we're going to start with the QHIN technical framework. That's kind of the foundation and basis that sets the requirements for the functions and the technology to support the exchange of information from QHIN, Qualified Health Information Network, to QHIN. So it does not dictate in the QHIN technical framework what happens that last mile. This is the QHIN to QHIN exchange, but it does further constrain and specify some linkages to, for instance, a facilitated fire exchange SOP. The testing procedures that need to happen to go through the gauntlet to actually get onboarded and designated as a QHIN, not just a candidate QHIN. And then also the performance measures that need to be reported ongoing. So think of it as the foundation that really sets the functional and technical requirements for any health information network itself, the QHINs themselves. Next slide, please. So just to remind those who may not be as familiar, the QHIN technical framework have the same overarching exchange modalities that are supported. So think of it as a query retrieve, the QHIN query, as we call it. So initiating gateway, responding gateway, and exchanging information that way. The QHIN message delivery is more of a push of information, and the facilitated fire component. The data that's shared across the networks, across these nodes, do represent, data systems that are maintained by those participants and sub-participants. So this is a full ecosystem that shows and describes how the network talks to each other. And then some of the things could be flow downs through some of these other technical requirements so that the Lego blocks join together appropriately. Go to the next slide. So highlighting the functions and the technology that's really supported. So Alan touched on some of these. There's a certificate that's used to encrypt all data that is given out to these QHINs so that all data is encrypted with the trust certificates. So certificate policy, how you secure the data end to end, the mutual authentication, the user authentication, and it includes how you do workflows. How do you discover a patient? How do you query and ask, do you have information for Didi Davis, by providing some of the demographic information and so forth to allow that document query retrieve functionality to go back and forth. The patient identity resolution, the record locator services, all these are things that are optional, and each of the QHINs can operationalize as they need, but they have to have the ability to do all of these things and interact with the directory so that they can find the endpoints to interact with, while auditing and making sure they document who has access to information so that that trust could be maintained if there is a breach, so that you could come back and find out where was this data shared along the way. So the constraints for the query and the initiating of the nodes themselves and the responding nodes, that type of information is well defined in the QHIN technical framework. Next slide. The overarching, again, putting this in kind of components, the RCE directory will maintain not only the SOAP web service endpoints that the QTF define, but also the fire endpoints when they're coming available. Those are going to continue, and we do expect fire to happen more at that last mile for participant to participant or sub-participant to sub-participant under the QHIN. So that's going to be more point to point because that's fire and how it operates in the transactional world. But you need to have those the RC directory needs to be able to have some of the, the phone book. How do you find each other? I mentioned earlier that the message delivery and the push transaction, as well as the QHIN query, all use the same type of data. They could be CCDA documents. It could be a fire bundle. It could be PDFs. The payload is agnostic. It's really trying to think about the highlights of the transactional basis, but it does define some of the lower bars of how you need to be in compliance for US CDI version 1, et cetera. So we try to make sure, working with ONC, that of course we leverage all of the regulations that are already in place to discover, and make sure that as we evolve the facilitated fire query support for, point to point, that we find how we can evolve that and include some additional information, maybe in the directory, that would help match make some of that information to find how and which TEFCA connected entities can do certain use cases and so forth as well. Next slide, please. The message transactions going through there very highly. So again, the query, the message delivery option, which is the push, is using an IHE cross-community document reliable push, using the transaction ITI 80 for those that follow the technical terms of it. But this is kind of a visual showing that there's a sender and there's a recipient. Somebody sending and pushing the data, it routes through the QHINs, and the recipient at the back end, whether it's a participant or sub-participant, it's that last mile, the clinician that's actually in, looking at the payload, opening up that fire bundle or the CCDA document, and looking at the information. So it's the end-to-end push secured, so that all of that is maintained through the infrastructure in a standard way. Next slide. The message query retrieve or data query workflow has multiple IHE transactions that are defined. And for what it's worth, these are in production in other networks already. So TEFCA is the ONC ASTP ONC government endorsed framework, but there is the care quality framework that has these same standards in line today, with more than 35 networks exchanging almost 1 billion clinical documents every single month. So the query for patient information to do the patient matching is that first transaction, the XCPD, cross-community patient discovery, and then the XCA query and retrieve, or how you query and retrieve that information. And the standards have been well defined, well adopted across the industry, exchanging, again, large amounts of data. So we're expecting TEF to continue evolving that, but also growing the types of use cases and types of purposes of use over time. Next slide. So if you think about the QHIN technical framework version 2.0, which is the current one, this kind of highlights, I'm not going to read it to you, some of the changes in the 1.1, which is in production today, which really specified FHIR R4, the version 4.0.1, and those exchange purposes. Version 2 actually evolved it to include some additional timelines. We pulled out some of the FHIR and components that were in QTF version 1.1 and made it a standard operating policy, so an SOP. So it was more modular and could change quicker over time. So this is kind of giving you some of the timelines. For instance, as of the end of this year, December 31st, 2024, all data created or captured should conform to US CDI version 1 or later. Legacy systems can capture information, may be captured conforming to the US CDI data classes and data elements. So it kind of gives you those timelines to evolve this, because we can't turn Titanic on a dime, but we can try to give some forward-looking momentum and hopefully allow implementers to adopt and hopefully already have these things in their timelines, but hopefully can have this as one other reason for that, to make sure that they meet their timelines for regulatory requirements as well. Next slide. The roadmap, the FHIR roadmap here, again, the link is on these slides. So these slides that will be sent out will have hyperlinks to all of these materials. So I know that the right side, that's a smaller chart, but it kind of gives you the future timeline roadmap, which is going to start with, right now, FHIR content is supported. That data is already being exchanged in some cases, as Alan highlighted, for public health, electronic case reporting. Some FHIR pieces are being sent for that. There is some FHIR exchange happening in pockets, but we are looking at the facilitated FHIR to be able to support in the QHIN world, FHIR APIs and the participants and sub-participants, and what they are required to do in supporting those APIs. So kind of trying to spell that out into a FHIR SOP. The roadmap gave the roadmap for the future. We go to the next slide. The SOP that we just published actually defines a little bit more about the purpose, the facilitated FHIR query scenarios that are adopted, the use case steps that are kind of defined already. So I invite you to look at that. That was published July 1st. And hopefully that will help you at least see a timeline as well as a future roadmap of things, how it's going to change over time. We do see adoption of this happening in public health, of course, between the payers and so forth. So we do expect this to grow over time. Next slide. The FHIR facilitated exchange really, again, has the same premise. You've got a QHIN, have a requester and a responder. And so this is kind of showing you that the QHIN works with the directory to find that FHIR endpoint discovery and be able to facilitate that information to be exchanged with its participants and sub-participants using that infrastructure to connect the dots. It doesn't mean it has to go through the QHIN. It can go directly between participants or sub-participants, but some of this to identify the patient, to be able to find that endpoint, some of that can be assisted by the QHINs. Next slide. This is the FHIR security roadmap. So again, think about FHIR implementation SOP outlines the security requirements. And somebody asked in one of the questions above, TEFCA and FAST, how are they related? I did answer that question, and this is where I'll highlight, for instance, the FHIR SOP points to the HL7 FAST Security Implementation Guide, known as SARA, SSRAA, version 1.0.0. We work very closely with FAST. We have the Sequoia project has a statement of understanding with HL7 to work directly with DaVinci, to work directly with FAST and other accelerators over time. And so we're very involved because we know that you guys are the feet on the street. So a lot of you represent some of those participants and sub-participants, and we want to make sure that we have that feedback loop to improve the standards from HL7 over time, but also have that feedback into some of the policy requirements and some of the things that we need to make sure are addressed in the security components for authentication and authorization, that framework to make sure that we ensure trust. So just to highlight, beginning January 1st, 2026, all fire adopters must follow the SARA, the FAST Security IG 1.0.0 for registration, authentication, and authorization. So this is giving folks runway room. This is, August of 24. So this gives hopefully implementers and developers of health information technology platforms to evolve that over time. Next slide. So this is just kind of giving you the prior to January 1st, 2026, fire doctors may determine their own exchange patterns or partners. So this is going to be flexible to allow for that, but beginning the January 1st, 2026, all must follow that SARA fire guideline. There is a fire implementation advisory group that is being established and will continue to track the progress. Folks always ask how they can get involved. We are involving in that implementation advisory group those QHINs and their participants and sub-participants that are actually in these pilots. So become, join one of the QHINs and their pilots to become part of that advisory group. Next slide. This will kind of highlight the patient matching pieces. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot, but just as anyone would need to do in any infrastructure, this policy framework actually gives some, some thought through how QHINs participants and sub-participants can choose their own patient matching techniques, but that there has to be something like that in place so that they can ensure not only supporting that fire query initiator workflow, but also the query or message delivery workflows. The patient matching can be centralized or it can be distributed. This is kind of optional. So again, highlighting that this is a participant sub-participant function that may happen under a QHIN as well for certain geographic territories and so forth. But the RC is actively participating in the national dialogue to continue improving patient matching because this continues to be a burden for many of us. So we're open to suggestions and we're also trying to take into account any best practices that have already been highlighted, things like Project USA, things like that. Next slide. Next slide. So just to highlight the education resources and the upcoming events, if you go to the next slide, we do have a whole lot of fact sheets on our rce.sequoiaproject.org website. The link is there at the bottom of the screen. It goes into a lot of the frequently asked questions you guys are asking here as well. How do you participate? What is TEFCA? How are QHINs designated, etc. If you go to the next slide, this kind of highlights the resource library. So this is all the resources, all of these SOPs, the QHIN technical framework, the common agreement, the whole package of documents that create this trust framework and maintain this over time can be found here. Not only the RCE website that Sequoia maintains, but it's also giving the link to the healthit.gov website where the TEFCA information is maintained by ASTP-ONC. And I invite you to our monthly informational calls. We do hold those. We just had one 2 days ago on August 20th. So our next one is September 17th. They usually are an hour long. The last two have been extended to 90 minutes because we had so many new packages, drop of information that we had to share with folks. Those are recorded, so feel free to go to the same link and go and look at the recordings and the slides from those few past informational calls, including the one from just a couple of days ago. Next slide. So here, I think, yes, we have 13 minutes left for Q&A. And I haven't looked at Q&A because I've been talking. So Alan, do you want to help us facilitate some of the Q&A since you probably are more familiar with what's still out there?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and I was going through some of the questions here as we were talking. But we've got, looks like 11.5 minutes left. We can probably run through some of these remaining questions that haven't been answered and see what else comes in, or if anyone has follow-ups on responses that were already shared. Starting at the top, as far as ones that haven't been answered yet, the question came in, why is TEFCA needed at all? Well, TEFCA is intended to be a framework for nationwide exchange, largely built based on the lessons that have been learned from other exchanges, such as carry quality, and even some of the things with HIEs and other frameworks and networks that have existed in the private sector, and satisfying the 21st century cures requirement for ONC to ensure that all of this is happening and people can get connected once to a single QHIN and have broad connectivity nationwide to everyone else who participates across all of the other QHINs for all of these exchange purposes as we continue to expand. There's one here that I think might have been a follow-up question. So I'm not, if somebody wants, I don't know if Didi, if you want to look at the answered ones,
Yeah.
here, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, Michelle.
But if we keep running down the list here and maybe circle back to that one, there was a question about sanctions for non-compliance. There is a lot going on right now with some of the governance SOPs. So right now we have a transitional council that is in place for the first year of TEFCA activities. And they are putting in place some updates to the SOPs for a governing council and for some QHIN and participant sub-participant caucuses that will have voting powers and abilities with change management process and all of that. And that does include and will include things on sanctions for non-compliance. There are processes for dealing with issues that are raised, for disputes between organizations. So there are some amount of how we would handle non-compliance today, but definitely more of that to come as all of that long-term governance gets established.
And Alan, I think I dug back on Michelle's this follow on. I think the original question was, what is the interaction between QHINs, TEFCA, and HINs? And I had responded, this is an evolving, this is continuing to evolve as new QHINs are designated and existing ones designate and onboard their participants and sub-participants. And I think this was the follow-on, or have they all been developed under TEFCA? So I think these are, we mentioned this is continuing to evolve. We continue adding on to the SOPs. They are a living and breathing package of documentation over time.
Great, thanks. What are some of the HL7 work groups that involve TEFCA? So I think interested in other thoughts as well. There are a number of things where we are trying to coordinate with HL7 in a number of areas with how we're handling things in TEFCA and making sure that everything is aligned with what others are doing. I've got Jonathan Coleman is listening in. He is the RCE CISO and is chatting me in Teams about some of the questions that he thought come in, and did note that there is a TEFCA security webinar during the HL7 fire security event in September that he will be presenting at, covering fire, QTF, some of the alignment with FAST and things like that. So that is an example of one of the areas, if you're interested in some of the security specific stuff, especially related to fire, that's going to be going on at the HL7 fire security event in September with Jonathan and then Dave Pike, a technical SME, there presenting on all of that as well.
Yeah, and just to add, there's not one work group. There's a lot of work groups that could become part of, feedback into what would be standards TEFCA points to. Security, the security and privacy work group that Alan just mentioned, does feed into that. The accelerators we've talked about, structured documents for CDA advancements, because you may want to allow for new types of information. As US CDI evolves, that feeds into a lot of different patient care, public health, a lot of different work groups. So I think, from an overall standpoint, any work group that works with transport standards, security standards, or content standards could become something that TEFCA points to in the future. But there's not one work group. Just think of it as the standards holistically. And I invite you to, to join what's your cup of tea. What are you most interested in?
Yeah, and then I think one clarification from one of the previous questions, and there was part of the follow-up question or I think was about a question related to some of the SOPs. And the SOPs are all they're separate from, or they're not the common agreement. They're not the terms of participation as far as those contractual terms. SOPs are included by reference as part of the common agreement and the terms of participation. So they are equally binding. They're just maintained as separate documents to have a separate process for how those can be updated. But those are documents that come from the RCE, from ONC policy direction, from the TEFCA governing council, and working with the QHINs, participant, sub-participant caucuses, once those all get established. So those would be specific documents that apply equally across everyone, like the common agreement in terms of participation do. There was a question, I answered a question in chat about population health, and there was a follow-up question here about population health was not included as one of the subcodes in the healthcare operations exchange purpose implementation SOP. However, the healthcare operations level 1 code is still there, and that is just healthcare operations as defined in HIPAA. And so anything that meets that definition, and the same for any of the other level 1 codes, anything that meets that definition can still be used, including population health under that level 1 code. The purpose of the level 2 codes is where we want to define, specific implementation guides or specific technical requirements, specific response requirements for a specific subcategory of a broader code, but it doesn't take away the ability to still use that broader code for anything else that meets the definition of that broader code. Question here, when will a newer version of US CDI be included? Newer versions provide significant increase in capability. In the QTF, and I think it was on one of the slides, obviously we were going through things pretty quick here, but Didi talked about one of the updated requirements in the QHIN technical framework, QTF version 2. We do have some requirements at a general level for data classes and vocabularies from US CDI v1, with a requirement for when the vocabulary standards, along with data classes and elements, increases to US CDI v3 in 2026. And so that is in the QTF today. Some of the implementation SOPs may already add additional requirements beyond that just baseline across everything requirement for the specific exchange purposes that those SOPs define. Following up on the question about fees above, in Tuesday's monthly info call, it was indicated that charges are not allowed for treatment or IAS services that require a response. Can you clarify further when fees can or cannot be charged? Yeah, so a responding organization cannot charge the initiating organization for certain exchange purposes, including treatment and individual access services. So if an individual through their app requests information from a healthcare provider, from a payer, from whoever else is responding, or a provider requests information for treatment from someone who is responding, the responding organization cannot base their response on a payment arrangement for sharing that data. However, that does not prevent the QHIN from charging its customers for participating in TEFCA in the first place, or an IAS app from charging its individual end users for participating in TEFCA in the first place. So there definitely will be other fees for organizations to participate in TEFCA. What those fees look like will vary across QHIN, across apps, largely based on the various services and things that they provide. As I think I answered on one of the other questions that was asked with a written response there, some of the QHINs do plenty of things outside of TEFCA Exchange and may bundle some of those services into, will be your QHIN and also do all these other things. And so those are things you definitely want to work through with your QHIN as far as the types of services, functionality that they provide, what all of that costs. But for those individual exchange purposes where there cannot be fees, the requester would not be charged a fee from whoever they're getting data from to get that data back.
Yeah, and Alan, I do have a question here. I know we're almost up on time. There are opportunities to participate, e.g. Interoperability Matters, and even new work groups launched this week that Sequoia Project hosts. So Interoperability Matters is separate. It's not TEFCA. It's a Sequoia thing only, but you are correct. There is, for instance, under Interoperability Matters, there's a payer-to-payer API work group, talking about what are the policy implications we need to start thinking about for future SOPs. There's a pharmacy work group that's just about to launch that may inform some of that work. So please, as pointed out by Janice, continue to get involved in anything. It could be HIMSS, it could be HL7, it could be a Sequoia work group, but all of these work groups are talking in some way around the standards and the policy requirements over time. There's a lot more questions here. I'm trying to pick ones that are going to be easy to answer in like 1 minute.
So some of these I think already got answered along with other questions about data standards and things. There's a question here about consent policies for behavioral health, mental health population, mental health data, things like that. We do have in the QTF, we define what are referred to as access consent policies. That is an assertion that can be made in a request that the requester has consent on file for the request they are making. That is generally intended to be used when an organization knows that that is specifically needed. For example, the Social Security Administration uses that when they request information for disability adjudication, and they already have a consent form that they collect from the patient, and they assert that they have that, make it available, and all of that. That could be used in those other types of similar situations as well, though the requesting organization would need to know that the consent is needed in order to have collected it and asserted in their request. Brokered fire versus facilitated. Facilitated is what we have right now. QHIN brokered is to come. Definitely we'll have more information about that and kind of the distinctions between the two. I don't know if there's necessarily pros and cons for either one, but rather certain types of organizations who it's just naturally going to make more sense that they support fire fully themselves, want to do it themselves in a facilitated manner versus brokering it through their QHIN because they don't fully support it themselves.
Brett asked, how do HL7 members track the progress on facilitated fire? Any opportunity to review? I think the Trebuchet project that Da Vinci's doing, some of those folks are, there's pockets of these same folks doing the same thing. So I don't think that there's that much in the way of draft materials that will be shared because those have all been published. But I think as things happen over time, we can work with those groups to make sure to share those as appropriate. I think we're up on time. Sadhna and Melinda, I'll turn it back over to you, Melinda, to maybe close us out. And I'm happy to answer any of these questions offline.
We got through most of them.
You guys did a great job. I can't believe how many questions you got through, both verbally and answering them, but I will make sure you get a copy. To everybody that joined us today, thank you so much for participating in this discussion. Bringing your live questions is what this is all about. And Alan and Didi, you guys just knocked it out of the park. What a great overview. I learned a ton today myself. Really appreciate your time today. This session will be sent out within 24 hours, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.